Okay, so today we're going to talk about The Grapes of Mrs. Rath by Stephen Mockenstern. And I'm going to walk you through this essay just as I would if we were in the classroom. And hopefully this will give you an idea of how to read a narrative essay, things to look for in a narrative essay, as well as things to think about as you're writing your own narrative essay. Okay, so we'll start with the title. The title of the story is The Grapes of Mrs. Rath, and this is an interesting title. It brings to mind not only the name of the teacher, Mrs. Rath, but The Grapes of Wrath is one of the novels by John Steinbeck, who is the author that Mrs. Rath introduced to Stephen as a teenager. Okay, so we have the first paragraph. Now, normally in the first paragraph, we can expect the author to try to bring the audience into what he's talking about to help us relate to what he's trying to say. So we have this first thing. I wonder if Mrs. Huldah Rath ever realized how much she affected my life. So he's capturing our attention with that line. Probably not. It's funny how a teacher gets stuck in your head and you find yourself referencing that for the rest of your life. So notice how that final sentence is not only his thesis, telling us what the essay is going to be about and how Mrs. Rath affected his life in a way, but it also brings the audience in by saying you. He's talking about how we all might get a teacher stuck in our head, and so he's assuming that we share that experience with him. Okay, so then in the next paragraph he goes on to give us some information about Mrs. Rath. We know that she taught English at the DeVilbiss High School in 1975, his junior year, so that gives us some more background information. He gives us some information about how she taught. Didn't talk much, just gave us a lot of stories to read. And then he gives us specific examples of those stories. So that's really important because not only does it paint a picture in our minds of what kind of classroom that was, but if you have ever read any of those stories, it brings you back into those books and kind of gives you a feel for what kind of books they were. Then he goes on to explain what the school was like. It was a rough and rowdy school. Notice again the specific details here. Inner city, 1,000 kids, half black, half white, a lot of distractions. So that gives you a picture in your mind of what the school was like, what it was like to go to that school. Then he gives you some more background about the school. During the 40s and 50s, it was the high school to attend, very academic, but by the mid-70s, it was starting to run down, perhaps stigmatized by a few race riots in 68. So that gives you an idea that this is a school with a lot of history, and we know what some of that history is. So notice how he did that with just one sentence, gives us the whole history of the school. So then we go back to Mrs. Rath and kind of get into the story here. He tells us something about her. She had an ability to recognize the kids who actually wanted to read and learn, and oftentimes would send a few of us down to the library where it was quiet and we could have some sanctuary from the usual classroom shenanigans. So again, that gives you an idea of what was the classroom like. A lot of shenanigans. What was the library like? It was a sanctuary. So you kind of picture that library in your mind, how it's quiet, a lot different from the rest of the school. So then he gives us a description of the library. It's bigger than the local public library, church-like, vaulted ceilings, tall windows, everything made of wood. Kind of gives us an idea that this, what it's laid out like. The librarian station is in the middle. It's full of light, tells us which way the windows are. The large mahogany doors would clank and creak, echoing down the hall, up around the stairwell, and into our classroom. So he's giving us sound here, not just sight, but sound. Okay? And so then he goes on to explain the significance. He was introduced to the work of John Steinbeck. So again, he gives specific examples, The Grapes of Wrath and Of Mice and Men. And so he says this is one of the happiest memories he has. Why? They were stories about his country and his people, flawed yet beautiful. He was discovering America. So the next thing he did was he got more books. And again, he's very specific. Tortilla Flat and The Wayward Bus. Asked Mrs. Rath what else he wrote and where I could get it. She loaned me her copy of In Dubious Battle. So again, an idea of what Mrs. Rath was like, that she would loan a student one of her own copies of a book. Okay, so then we go on to get the end of the story. The city sadly closed down De Vilbus High School a few years after I graduated. It was too big and too expensive. Talks about how it sat entry and then now it's reopened. Talks about his children going to that school and what it's like to go there and see what the building is like now and remember what it was like back then. And again, that's something that those of us who graduated a while ago can relate to, that feeling of going back and remembering, just being in a place makes you remember what it's like, and that's kind of what he's helping his readers do right now. And then his final sentence is the significance of it. Whenever I consider Steinbeck, my memory goes back to this classroom, the library, and Mrs. Huldah Rath's quiet ways, and I get the urge to plop down and read Cannery Row. So we get the significance of it, that this is a woman who instilled his love of reading and his love of Steinbeck. And so it's really important that when you are reading, you look for that significance. And when you're writing your own essay, you want to find the significance and relate that significance to your readers in ways that they can understand and appreciate. I hope that this helps you to read through this essay and helps you as you write your own.